So it's beautiful to listen to our children talk about the African Union, the model African Union. But I ask you children to take it a little bit further. It doesn't end with just a conversation about corruption in Africa. The bigger corruption in Africa is coming from outside. Try flying low over the DRC. You're going to see tarmacs in the middle of the jungle. You're going to see 747s flying into the DRC, picking up minerals and flying right outside the country. Do you think those multinationals are going to want to see peace in the DRC? Do you think they're going to want to see peace in South Sudan? No. A stable Africa is an Africa that cannot be exploited. So they will see to it that there will never be peace in Africa by any means necessary, unless you come to the table and do something about it. For a continent that doesn't have a single gun manufacturing company, we simply have endless supply of guns. How? How is this okay that Africa continues to be exploited to this extent? How is it okay that the world has watched as France is taking cold, hard cash out of Africa? How is this okay? I want to know. United Nations, answer that. Secretary General Guterres, answer that. When you all meet every year in New York, what are you talking about? That is our reality as Black people. And only we can change that. Yes. I am very encouraged by the president of Benin. He has put in a formal request for all the bank reserves his country has deposited with France. Yes. So to France I say, we are watching you, France. There better not be a coup in Benin, because that is your modus operandi. There better not be any instability in Benin, because that is your modus operandi. I'm hoping that the rest of the West African countries, quote unquote, former French colonies, can also demand a refund of their deposits. Africa is on the move. Let's join hands. Let's support those countries in what they have started. And since I'm standing here in a historical Black college, that education and understanding is start with you, our youth. This is a fight that I know very well that we will not be able to finish. But golly, we want to make sure that you understand fully what is going on. So when we pass the baton, you understand the issues. No more shall we continue to be ignorant. Our eyes are open. We know our Africa. We are going to reconnect with our roots. African Americans, you must understand there is a void that is deep in each and everyone's subconscious. It is a void that affects everything you do. First, you must understand you have that void. In this country, with the exception of the American Indians, everybody is a foreigner. And everybody has their roots outside the United States. And the rest of the races are connected to their roots, with the exception of the African Americans. You're too busy running away from your roots. You're busy denying who you are. Well, guess what? It is what it is. You are an African, and Africa is home. And the sooner you wake up and realize and accept that Africa is home, the sooner you are going to fill that void. For as long as that voice is in you, you're always going to be like a ship without an anchor. The wind blows this way, here you go. The wind blows the other way, here we go. Find your base. Go home. Africa is where you belong. And Africa is where your roots are. Thank you. But as I began to make a diagnosis, I analyzed the situation, and my final assessment was that the ignorance that the world has about Africa is the disease that I must fight. So I set out to have a plan, and I began implementation. Because it is only when that disease is treated, it is only then and only then can we embark on a true healing path for Africa and her children. I'm going to ask you one question. If I were to ask you right now, all of you, what color is the devil? I want you to answer that question to yourself. And I'm going to pause for 2 seconds. Let me guess. Most of you said black, didn't you? Then I'm going to ask you another question. What color are the angels? Let me guess. Most of you said white. Who has seen either? And yet we accept it. So you take a group of people, you say the color black is associated with the devil. Everything bad is black. You wear black to go to funerals. The villains in the movies are black. Everything undesirable is black. You take a group of people and say, you too are black. No matter how we try as black mothers to raise our children at home and tell them you're black and you're beautiful, the minute they step foot outside that door, they are immersed in nothing but negativity about that which they represent. How do you raise a child with good self-esteem in such a world? Then I took it back a step further. You see, growing up in my village in Zimbabwe, the British did not come to Zimbabwe until 1896. Prior to that, we had our own gods that we worshipped. We had spirit mediums who were our intermediaries to the higher power. They had no color until the British arrived. Then the British began to, you can remember the missionaries were sent to Africa to teach us how to read, but not how to reason. So we're programmed to receive that which they wanted us to receive. And so one of the things they taught us was the issue of black and white. Remember, like 1896 in my country, we did not have those colors. And I was not referred to as black, I was African. But somehow we were just told that you're black. And then the other race is white. And then the other race, you take white color, you say white is pure, the angels are white, you wear white to go to weddings, you wear white for christening, and then you take another group of people and say, you're white. So the children are raised that you're beautiful, everything that you represent is perfect, and when they step outside the door, the world validates what they are being told at home. Now you take these two children. One is surrounded by nothing but negativity about that which they represent. The other is surrounded by nothing but positivity about that which they represent. How do you expect these children to look at themselves as equal? These are some of the subliminal messages that are being passed on to our children. And in my own assessment, and when you look at it from the African point of view, it explains why some of our leaders, people who are supposed to represent us, when they sit across the table with others who don't look like them, they automatically feel inferior. It is a serious problem. It affects our ability to feed our children as mothers. It affects our ability to provide for us children to go to school, provide good healthcare systems, provide good infrastructure. It starts right there. The failure to stand up and defend that which you believe in, and defend that which is blatantly wrong. 1884, after the colonizers had been running around our continent of Africa, They wondered how they were going to defeat these people. You see, you got to understand, before the Greek civilization, before the Roman Empire, there was Africa. The pyramids were built 2,500 years before the Greek civilization. Have you ever wondered why the Greek philosophers, the mathematicians, where were they sent for training, for education, for retraining? They were sent to Africa. Why were they sent to Africa? Because civilization, as we know it, began in Africa. Civilization was in Africa before they had it in Europe. You see, the history books choose to begin history from here going forward. What they don't tell you is that even the English language is based on the Yoruba language. Humanity, as we know it, began in Africa. Without the African, there would not be any other races. It's just a simple fact. So they came together and set out a plan. Prior to 1884, you got to remember, Africa was made up of powerful kingdoms. The countries that we know as African countries today did not exist. So if you're going to be doing your DNA testing, I urge you, don't settle for I'm from Nigeria. Settle for what is my kingdom. Yes, I'm a proud member of the Monomotapa kingdom. Are you an Ashanti? Are you from the Benin kingdom? That's who we were before the Berlin Conference. So why did they meet in 1884 at the invitation of the then Chancellor of Germany, Bismarck? Bismarck said, let's all come together, we the colonizers. Because keep in mind, at that time, they were beginning to fight each other over how to distribute what they had looted from the Africans. So you see, the French would loot from the Africans, then the British would come and then loot from the French, what the French had looted from the Africans, and then the Belgians would come, they'll loot from the British, what the British looted from the French, that the French looted from the Africans. They were getting ready to have a European war on the African soil. So Bismarck called his sidekick, the then King of Belgium, and said, let's meet in Berlin. Let's strategize on how we can effectively loot from the Africans in a unified way that does not lead us into a war. So they met in Berlin to strategize on how to see to it that Africa and her children are forever defeated and dominated. Make no mistake about that. I repeat, they met in Berlin from November of 1884 to February of 1885 to strategize on how to effectively see to it that Africa and her children are forever defeated and dominated. That was 135 years ago. Fast forward 2019, the strategy remains in place today. History tells us that they set across from big old map of Africa. They proceeded to chop Africa up into tiny little economies that we see today. Tiny economies that clearly cannot survive on their own. Tiny economies that, should they survive, like black people always do, they're easy to destabilize. And then after they chopped up these little countries, they often say the divisions were so arbitrary that husband and wife were in bed, and when they woke up in the morning, the husband was in Zambia and the wife was in Malawi. And the assignments of these countries to the colonizers were also done in a way that they would provide maximum destruction. I often say, have you ever pictured driving from Zambia? You're speaking English. Pretty soon, you're in Angola. You're speaking Portuguese. A little north, you're in DRC. You're speaking French. Go a little west, you're in Equatorial Guinea. You're speaking Spanish. A little further north, you're in southern Cameroon. You're speaking English. Keep going north. Now you're in northern Cameroon. You're speaking French. A little west, now you're in Nigeria. You're speaking English. You see, give it a couple of generations. People who were once one will not know each other because they now speak a different language. They now have borders. They now have a different flag, and each one with their own anthem. People who were once one, completely divided up. It was all by design. Then they take those little economies and gave them the same sovereignty on the world stage as the big boys. How do you take Central Africa Republic and put Central Africa Republic on the same stage with China and say negotiate? How do you take Malawi and put Malawi in the same room across from India and say negotiate? How do you take Djibouti and put them in the same room with the United States and say negotiate? Africans are defeated before the game even begins. I often use an example of taking my poor husband, if you knew him, and put him in the same boxing ring with Mike Tyson. He said, my husband will collapse before he even gets on the stage. And when he collapses, it's like, what's wrong with you, Dr. Carroll? Can't you fight Mike Tyson? The world is not fair. So when we find ourselves being thrown, oh, African leaders are corrupt. Oh, that's a big one. They will hit you with that every time. And every time it's supposed to be a conversation stopper about Africa. You see, after they divided us up into the tiny little economies that we are today, then between 1958 and 1961, they started giving us quote-unquote independence. France did something absolutely deplorable. Made the former, and I'm going to use the word former loosely, French colonies, because they still are colonized, sign a document which they called the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. Dig this. On one hand, we're giving you your independence, but on the other hand, sign this document that you are agreeing to continue to be colonized. So two countries said, no way, Jose, we aren't doing this, Guinea and Mali. The French could not understand it. How could an African country dare not want to be affiliated with France? So in their anger, history tells us that they went into those two countries, took everything that they thought they had brought. To hear Mugabe put it, they even took the last teaspoon and the last chair. Proceeded to pour concrete into the sewage pipes, completely devastating the two economies. This was also done as a way of letting the other countries know that should you refuse to sign this document, this is the fate that awaits you. So the rest of the country signed. Fast forward, 2019, the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization remains in place. What is special about this? The Pact for the Continuation of Colonization said, 1, you Africans, you do not know how to manage your money. You shall deposit 85% of your bank reserves with the French Central Bank under the control of the French Minister of Finance. The French government will take all your monies, collectively invest your monies in the French stock market under the French name. And you don't have to know what the returns are. Should you wish to access some of your money, keep in mind that countries are now left with only 15% of their reserves. You have to submit your country's financial report. And if approved, you get to access up to 20% of your deposits from the previous year as a loan at commercial interest rates. I'm going to repeat that. Should you want to access some of your own money, you have to submit your own country's financial report. And if approved, you get it as a loan at commercial interest rate. So you go from having a humongous credit with France to now owing France for borrowing your own money, a loan that you'll never be able to finish paying. They also said, all your minerals discovered and yet to be discovered, French companies have the first right of refusal. You go to those countries today, all major contracts, French companies have the first right of refusal. The water supply, the power supply, the mining fixtures, the oil rigs, roads construction, airports, French companies have the first right of refusal. If anything is left, the people in your country may get it. They also said, your military can only be trained by France. You can only purchase military equipment from France. France shall have military presence in your country and can invade your country without notice if France feels that her interests in your country are being violated. What constitutes a violation? If you decide to pull from the pact. Keep in mind, as part of the financial situation, France also created a special currency just for West African countries and Central African countries that is called a CFA. And that France is the only country that can print your money. So a violation would constitute an African leader saying, I no longer want my money printed by France. I'm going to start printing my own money. That's a violation, and it can call for France invading your country. In the past many years, we've had 67 coups in Africa out of 26 countries. Of the 26 countries, the coups, 16 coups, 16 countries were former French colonies. To date, 22 African leaders were assassinated during a coup, documented all of them. France was behind it, simply because France felt they were quote-unquote threatening French interests by wanting to pull out of this horrible, horrible pact. 2019, nothing has changed. Countries are still depositing their funds to France. French companies still have first right of refusal. So if you are an African president, newly appointed, your first day in office, your chief of staff comes to you and reads to you the do's and don'ts as stipulated by the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. Mr. President, you have given up your financial resources. You have given up control of your natural resources. You have given up your military. What power do you have? May I take you back to the question? When people start the conversation with corruption in Africa, I give it to you. I'm not disagreeing. We have corruption in Africa. But who doesn't have corruption on earth? Which country, which continent, which region is free of corruption? And yet what happens in Africa, so much light is shone on it. And when the same thing happens elsewhere, it's minimized. You see, I liken to today, because of the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization, France alone, that little bitty country, is taking out of Africa over $500 billion. Over $500 billion. And by the time they finish investing that money into the French stock market, they're realizing trillions of dollars in any given year. Park that. The watchdogs for corruption are saying out of Africa, 50 billion gets out of the continent from corruption. Now you got two thieves. You have a thief with a briefcase with 50 billion and another thief, a small thief, with a briefcase with 500 billion. Which thief are you going to go after? The world wants you to be stuck with a thief with 50 billion and not the thief with 500 billion that's going to become trillions of dollars. Do you quickly realize how the 50 billion becomes a crumb under the table? And we are meant to fight each other for which one of the brothers has gotten a larger chunk under the table. So that way we never have to get on the table and talk about not a 3-course meal, not a 5-course meal, not a 10-course meal. I call it a 100-course meal going on the table. The question I have is, why has it been so difficult for us as Africans to say enough is enough? How long are we going to keep watching this carnage go on and we say nothing? It goes back to the mind. It goes back to that fear. It goes back to that sense of inferiority. And I go back to the diagnosis I made when I went to Washington. That until we black people understand that we are suffering from the legacy of colonization, that we are suffering from the legacy of slavery, that while we may have lost the shackles in our legs and our hands, the shackles of the mind continue. Until we realize that we are a wounded people and we need healing, nothing about our circumstances is going to change. We are sick people. But to be sick, first you must realize and accept that you're sick. How do you go to the doctor if you don't think you're sick? We are not only in the doctor's waiting room on an outpatient basis. We are not even in the hospital in a general ward. As black people, we are in the intensive care. And we need to realize that. United Nations. It is a body that's supposed to be the watchdog for human rights violations. France is on the UN Security Council. And you see me pick up on France. There are other colonizers too, who are still colonizing Africa. But France did something extraordinary through this pact. We're talking cold, hard cash out of Africa. That we must stop. And immediately, we must do that. So France remains as a member of the UN Security Council. And yet France today remains one of the biggest perpetrators of human rights violations in Africa. And everybody is giving it, the world is giving it a blind eye. France remains the biggest risk to peace and security in Africa today. And nobody is talking about it. So I decided that is, if I am going to deliver on my mandate As the African Union representative to the United States, our people must know the truth and nothing but the truth. That no more shall we continue to be fed lies or be fed information that the powers that be feel we must know and stop there. We will know the truth. And so it is. My first video was addressed to the African diaspora to precisely put things in perspective, starting with the Berlin Conference, the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. 1963, when our Pan-African leaders got together in an effort to undo the Berlin Conference, but they failed. Because when they went to Addis Ababa at the invitation of Emperor Haile Selassie, they were divided. We had the Pan-African group that said, Africa for the Africans, African Union now. There were only 7 countries: Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. The rest were the nationalists, the Monrovia group. They said, let's go slow. So it is, they won. We often say Africa lost when the Pan-African group, the Casablanca group, lost. Year in, year out, the leaders came up with a compromise which they called the Organization of African Unity. They meet twice a year to discuss issues pivotal to the continent. The issue of an Africa speaking with one voice was tabled at every summit. And year in and year out, they failed to reach consensus until March of last year, 2018, when we finally agreed on what we are now calling the African Continental Free Trade Area, where Africa is now saying enough is enough. Africa must speak with one voice. That's the only way for Africa to take her place on the world stage, is when Africa enters the world stage as one giant Africa. So it is July this year, the African heads of states officially launched the African Continental Free Trade Area. And beginning July next year, Africa, the sleeping giant, will enter the world stage as one customs union. It's been a long journey. I call it a 700-year courtship, and that goes back to when the colonizers first came to Africa. I'm calling it a 56-year pregnancy. That's when our Pan-African leaders met in 1963 and started the conversation about a united Africa speaking with one voice. The baby is now born, and her name is the African Continental Free Trade Area. You see, the children of Africa must realize that now we need diapers, we need formula, there are going to be sleepless nights, this baby is going to cry, this baby is going to throw tantrums. We need to be ready to take care of this baby. And the only way to effectively take care of this baby is when the children of Africa are awoken and get rid of the shackles of the mind. Because if we do not wake up as a race, if we do not realize that we are suffering from this affliction, if we do not seek the help that we need and the healing that we must have, guess what's going to happen come July? You see, well, you got to understand what the African Continental Free Trade Area is doing. The African Continental Free Trade Area is creating an economy that's $3 trillion with a workforce intra-Africa of 1.27 billion. An environment that you can spread and grow your business like wildfire from one country to the other. The borders that have kept us from trading with each other as African countries are in the process of being melted as we speak. Beginning July 9 next year, 90% of all goods being traded within Africa are going to be zero duty. We're looking at quadrupling intra-Africa trade in the next 5 years. Africa is on the move. The question is, are the children of Africa ready to step up and take what is rightfully yours. You got to understand, around the globe, as black people, the reason we are so disrespected is because we're poor. Most of us don't own anything. Singularly, while we were given our independence, the one thing that was denied from us is economic liberation. The African heads of states are saying, African wealth belongs to the African children. The African Union defines African diaspora as all people of African descent living outside Africa. The African Union is calling on its children to come home and, for a change, build the Africa that you want. The colonizers have been building the Africa that they want. The game is up. You see, you don't go to China and find black people driving the Chinese development agenda. You don't go to Europe. You don't go to Mexico, India, and find black people driving those regions' development agenda. The reality is, you must not, cannot, should not, and golly, will not go to Africa and find non-Africans driving the African continental development agenda. Unless, of course, you, the children of Africa, the inheritors of Africa's wealth, choose to vacate that place that has your name. The choice is yours. The environment is ready. And so, I'm on a mission to see to it that we, people of African descent, truly understand our Africa. Truly realize that we have been lied to, but that we're smart enough to know better. That we have been sleeping, that it's time to wake up. You see, a united African diaspora is a sleeping giant. It is the sleeping giant that is needed to bring the sustainable change that Africa desires.
I just want to say that here at Albany State, we strongly believe that education is the vaccine to poverty. And so we stand with you, we stand alongside you, and we support your mission and your fight. Please accept this as a small token of our appreciation. Thank you.
Actually, one other point that I'd started discussing with the provost, the Association of African Universities now have their offices in Washington, D.C. It's an association that represents 400 universities across the continent. With a one-stop shop, you can pretty much pick where you want to go in Africa. I would hope that, I told the provost that I will bring them back. The enrollment, we must expand the international study program, not only for students, but also for professors. This can be done very easily, and I'm on a mission. I will work with the professor to see to it that next year we have as many of you students going to Africa. We want to establish, it should not be expensive. You see, white schools are very good at taking care of themselves. My kids, one of my kids speaks French like a Frenchman, sadly, because of the program that she was in. All we paid for was the airline ticket. Even the professors, I housed 3 professors every year from France as part of the exchange program. We can do this. We need to establish host parents. We need to establish host parents in Africa and here. The schools must commit to accommodation. There are organizations that when we work together, our students should never have to struggle. There are airlines that are making money out of going to Africa. Let's hold them accountable. There are businesses making money in Africa. Let's hold them accountable. There are very different ways that we can see to it that our children get to where they want to go. I want to give you my word. I am going to fight to see that our children go to Africa. And
Provost, you have my word.